This is Fromage. It's a board game set in early 20th century France, all about making and selling cheese. This got me wondering, how accurate is the cheese history it presents? Hey there, cheese historians, I'm Juliet and this is Cheese History, a channel where we talk about the history of cheese and all of its weird and wonderfulness. And today we're talking about a board game, which is a bit unusual on this channel because normally I talk about the history of cheese, significant events in cheese history, different types of cheeses, etc, etc. But when I found out about Fromage and the fact that it's a board game about making cheese set in the early 20th century in France, I couldn't pass up the opportunity in digging a little bit into the cheese history presented in the game, and I thought you guys might find it interesting. Just to be clear, this is not in any way a sponsored post. I found out about Fromage and bought the copy of the game myself, and I thought I'd do a video about it because it's about early 20th century cheese making in France, which is cheese history, and this is a channel all about cheese history. First, a little bit about the game so that you kind of have a general understanding of how it works. So this is the game board, and it's divided up into 4 different quadrants. So this is a game that can be played anywhere between 1 and 4 players, and each player plays the quadrant facing them on any particular turn. So, for example, this is the quadrant facing me, so this is the quadrant I would start playing in. Generally speaking, in each turn you can do up to 2 different actions. You can make a cheese on this part of the board, here, 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 or here, depending on which side is facing you. You take one of your cheese workers and make a cheese that corresponds to the cheese on their base. So we have blue cheeses with these ones. We have soft cheeses, which have the white base, and hard cheeses, which have the yellow base. So you make your cheese that corresponds to the worker that you're using, and you can also collect resources by putting another worker into the resource quadrant at the top there. Once each player has placed their workers on the board, you rotate the board a quarter turn clockwise, and then you're faced with a new quadrant, and any workers that have their faces towards you, you can take back off the board and use again in the next quadrant. In each of the different quadrants you can earn points and gain resources, and the whole point of this is more or less to have the most expensive cheese empire you can possibly get across the board, gaining more points than any of your competing cheesemakers. That's the very simplified explanation of how the game works. So this is not a review of the game itself per se, but rather the little details of history, and particularly cheese history, that have gone into creating it and how accurate those are. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? Because this is supposed to be set in early 20th century France, and there are a lot of historical elements throughout the game. So I want to talk about those rather than all the details of how the game is played, what you do, and whether or not it makes a good game. So let's get into it. Let's start with some of the general elements of the game before going into each of the 4 quadrants, and then also the cheeses that are represented in the game. So let's start with the cheese workers that we have. We have 4 different designs of cheese workers, which you can see here. So we have both men and women represented, and this is pretty historically accurate because both men and women would have made cheese in early 20th century France. It tended to be that women would make cheese on a smaller scale, so at home, or smaller scale businesses, whereas the men tended to be making cheese at a much larger scale in the emerging factories because there was a bias towards factory work being heavy labor and therefore sort of the arena of men rather than women, even though the women who made cheese, they were strong women because they had to be able to lug big cheeses around and do quite a bit of manual labor in order to make cheese. But in terms of the game, both men and women made cheese in early 20th century France, so we have cheese workers who are both dairy men and dairy women, which is awesome. Now I have to remember where everyone came from. France, that's where everyone came from. In general, the game doesn't focus on the process of making cheese, turning milk into curds, so much as it does the process of aging and selling cheese and becoming really well known for really good cheese. Speaking of factories and industrial scale cheese making, there's a single player mode of this game where You take one of these player boards and you flip it over, and you have instructions for playing a single player game against the corporation, which is like the evil industrial cheesemaker who doesn't care so much about quality, more about just pumping out as much cheese as possible. I like that detail because that was one of the tensions that was around in the early 20th century, as you had increasing industrial large-scale cheesemaking pushing out the smaller scale artisan cheesemakers. So I quite like the idea of, if you're playing the single player version, then you're going up against the evil corporation who are out to try and drive you out of the market, and your goal is to make more better cheese than them. I like that detail. One of the questions I have about this game is when is exactly the early 20th century? Because quite a lot happens in France in the early 20th century, if you think about it. Early 20th century, maybe say 1900 to latest 1950. There are 2 world wars that happen in that time, which has a big impact on France because they are involved in both of those conflicts, and those conflicts have devastating impacts on France and French cheesemaking. So I kind of wonder, why not the early 19th century or the mid 19th century? Why the early 20th century? Why is the game set then and not a bit earlier when you don't have these 2 major conflicts? Why the early 20th century? And when in the early 20th century? Are we talking pre-World War I, between the 2 wars? I mean, post-World War II is probably a little bit late for early 20th century. You're talking mid-20th century then. So questions about that timing kind of play into some of the critiques I have of some of the elements of this game coming up a little bit later. Let's talk about the 4 quadrants of the game. This one's the Bistro, and Bistro started out in France as small little cafes where simple food and drink was sold, and these were definitely around in the early 20th century, particularly in big cities like Paris. Today they're kind of more upmarket places in many cases, but in the early 20th century they would have been places where you could get a basic meal and something to drink. So the idea of a French person eating cheese in a bistro is a very accurate detail. So I think this is pretty good. The purpose of this particular quadrant is to get as many full tables covered in your cheese as possible. So obviously you want the diners to be eating your cheese and not other people's, and the higher quality cheese the better. I'm also going to talk about the different resources as we go around, just to keep things kind of simple. So here we have the livestock, and these are represented by these different livestock tokens. The fact that they're cows, sheep, and goats don't make any difference to gameplay itself. They're all effectively a livestock token. And the purpose of these tokens is on your player board. You can collect them, and then you can make extra cheeses. I think it's quite a cool detail to have cows, sheep, and goats, because while most cheese in France is made with cow's milk, there are also famous goat's milk cheeses like chèvre, and also sheep's milk cheeses like Roquefort. So in France you have cheeses made with all 3 types of milk, even though the vast majority are made with cow's milk. So that is the bistro. So if we rotate the board, we come to the Fromagerie. Now, a Fromagerie is basically a place where cheese is sold. So here the point is to get your cheese on as many shelves in the window as possible. And fromageries are indeed a French thing, just like cheesemongers are in other parts of the world. So this is a fairly straightforward quadrant. There's not too much to say about it. There is quite a bit, however, to say about the fruit resource. So here you can collect fruit tokens, and the fruit tokens, if I can find the strawberry one, and the fruit tokens are used to make different types of cheese. So you'll notice, say for example on this board, you'll have this soft cheese with a fruit symbol on it, a little strawberry, and you also have like this hard cheese with a jar of jam symbol. What you do with your fruit tokens is you get your player board. Once you've collected them, if you make a cheese with a fruit symbol, you need to have a fruit that you move there, and if you make one with a jam symbol, you need to move it to the little jam section, and then you multiply them by each other at the end to figure out how many points you got. Now, if you know anything about cheese making, you'll know that there are indeed some cheeses that are made with fruit, that the fruit is added to the cheeses at some point in the cheese making process, and you get kind of fruited cheese. So fruit and cheese making is a thing. It's not super common, but you do get it particularly with some soft cheeses or cheeses that are sort of processed after they've already been aged, sort of broken up, smushed together with fruit, and then repackaged and sold. Very rare to have fruit added very early on in the cheesemaking process and then aged with a hard cheese. So fruit being involved in cheesemaking is a thing. Jam, on the other hand, as far as I'm aware, is not used in making any type of cheese. If you know of a cheese that is made with jam, as in jam is added while the cheese is being made, before it's being packaged and sold, please let me know in the comments, because I have searched high and low and all I can find regarding jam and cheese is, of course, eating jam and cheese together. So perhaps they mean here that this is a cheese that pairs really well with jam or some kind of fruit paste, and therefore you need that to go with it to sell it and make really good cheese. But the idea of making cheese with jam, that is not a thing, and I don't think that has ever been a thing in 20th century France or anywhere else in the world. But if you know of any, do let me know in the comments, because I'd love to know. So yes, that's the fruit. So now we will rotate the board again, and we come to the festival. I don't have much to say about this particular quadrant either. The purpose of it basically is to make as long of a connected line of cheeses as possible, because the whole point of a festival is a place where everybody comes together for like food, drink, entertainment, showing things off. So you want to get your cheese out there in front of the public at a big festival, just like you would today at a big sort of food festival. So these sort of events have kind of always been a thing, going back hundreds and hundreds of years in France, other parts of Europe, all over the world really. So a festival is a place to sell and market your cheese in early 20th century France or any other time or place, and festivals definitely happened in France. For the resources here, we have these structures, and we once again go over to our player board. You gather different structures, and when you've got, say, 3, you unlock this particular feature. So you place your structures here, unlocking whatever bonus it kind of gives you. In terms of historical things, yeah, they had structures, they had buildings, they had dairies, they had cheese shops, they had places to do things. So that's fair, historically accurate. Nothing much more to say about the festival and the structures part of the resources. Let's go to our 4th quadrant. Alright, and this quadrant of the board is called Villes, and a ville in French is a town or a city. So the map is divided up into 6 different regions of France, and the cheeses are made in cities of different sizes, and you're basically playing to control the different regions through being the biggest cheesemaker in each of those cities, effectively. Now, a word about the division of France on this map. This doesn't really look like any way that France, I don't think, has ever been divided. I don't think it's ever been divided quite so neatly into 6 little quadrants. France today can be divided into lots of different regions and departments, so it's way, way more complicated than this. And even in the early 20th century, it was way more complicated than this. So this map is not in any way a historically accurate representation of how France was divided in the early 20th century. But it is kind of a cool gameplay feature, because you've got 6 roughly equal sections of France that you're competing with the other players to control. So another thing about cheesemaking is that cheesemakers tend to specialize in making particular types and styles of cheese most of the time. Some will be quite general and make a range of cheeses, but some will specialize and make only one specific type of cheese. And also different regions tended to be where different types of cheese were made. Camembert, for example, originates from Normandy, so Camembert tended to be made in Normandy, whereas other cheeses like Roquefort are made in more southern parts of France around the town of Roquefort-sur-Sauzon. So French cheesemaking is quite localized, but even though cheeses are made in quite localized areas, they're definitely sold as widely as possible, because the whole point is to try and sell your cheese to as many people as possible. So the idea of cheesemakers competing to dominate as much of the map of France as possible seems reasonable to me. The other nitpicky point to have about this map is the inclusion here of Strasbourg. And the reason for that is that Strasbourg is part of the region of Alsace, and Alsace and Lorraine had to be ceded by France to Germany at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, so that's the late 19th century. And France didn't get them back until the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Which is early 20th century. So if we're talking about this game being set in early 20th century France, I would say 1900 to 1919 is a huge chunk of early 20th century France. And for that time, Strasbourg was not part of France, but instead part of Germany. Obviously, France would have liked to have it back at any moment, and they did take it back the first opportunity they got. But For part, at least, of early 20th century France, Strasbourg was not part of France, but rather part of Germany. So that's a fun detail. So that's enough said about Strasbourg. Probably shouldn't be on the map. And the resource we have here are orders. So for the orders, you'd have all of these cards, and each one of them is a different French cheese. So for example, we have Brie, Fromage de Meux, many other French cheeses that I'm not going to try and pronounce because, well, there's a lot of them. So this is quite an interesting point of the game. The point of these orders are, if you have one of these cards and you make a cheese that matches its type in both, say, soft cheese and its level of bronze, silver, or gold, then you have completed the order and you gain points by completing different orders. So you have all of these different types of cheese cards, which I'm going to put out all over the board because I think they're all very interesting. So you have all of these different types of cheeses, and all the cheeses are kind of divided into three categories. They're either soft cheese, blue cheese, or hard cheese, which are three ways of dividing different types of cheeses. So you have your soft young cheeses that are pretty squishy, have a high moisture content. Your blue cheeses that are of course made with Penicillium roqueforti, so they have blue mold all through them. And then you have your hard cheeses, which are, you know, your much more solid, dense cheeses. These three categories are fairly straightforward ways of categorizing cheeses. They're also divided into bronze, silver, and gold, effectively by kind of how long a particular cheese takes to age. So a bronze cheese, according to these little cards, ages for 1 month, for example, whereas a silver cheese aged for 2 months, and a gold cheese ages for 3 months. And this doesn't change depending on whether a cheese is a soft cheese, a blue cheese, or a hard cheese. Basically, if it's a gold level cheese, it's aged 3 months according to this game. Now, if you know much about cheese making, you'll know that a lot of hard cheeses in particular age for much longer than 3 months. And this is true even of some of the types of cheeses that are part of the game. So, for example, this one here, Mimolette, which is a silver level hard cheese, so it's aged for 2 months according to this game. Well, everything I can find says that Mimolette is actually aged for anywhere between 3 and 24 months. So if anything, it should be in the gold level category rather than the silver. Another example is this one, Forme de Montbrison, which here is categorized as a bronze level blue cheese. So it is a blue cheese, but it's aged for more like 3 months rather than 1 month. So this in many ways should be a gold level blue cheese. And there are other cheeses here as well that they're in a category that doesn't actually reflect how long they age for. The idea of cheeses aging for either 1, 2, or 3 months isn't reflective of cheese making much at all, because most hard cheeses will age for 3 months or more, whereas most soft cheeses will age for less than 3 months. And blue cheeses can kind of be all over the place depending on whether they're a harder blue cheese, which require longer aging periods, or a much softer blue cheese that requires less. Now, I can see that they've chosen this particular way of defining aging because it works within the way the game works. Now, bronze cheeses are cheeses that when you make them, the worker will come back to you after you've rotated the board once. So the worker is then facing you, so you can get that worker back. Whereas a silver level cheese is one where the worker will only come back after you've rotated the board twice. So that's once, and then that's twice. So now that worker is facing me, so I can take him back. Whereas a gold level cheese is one where you have to rotate the board 3 times in order to get the worker back. So once, twice, 3 times before you get the worker back. Now he's facing me. So within like the game it kind of makes sense, but it's a bit misleading to have all of these different types of cheeses that age for 1, 2, or 3 months, and most of the cheeses in the order cards that are actually in those categories age for less or more than that actual period. Now, some of them, of course, are like bang on. We have, where is it, Camembert. You can age that for just a month before you ended up shipping it off to be sold. You could also age it for a bit longer than that. Most home cheese makers probably would. Another example would be Roquefort, famous French blue cheese, which is indeed aged for about 3 months, but it could also be aged for longer than that. So some of them are within the right age range, some of them are not within the right age range, but I can see why they've got those definitive age ranges as part of the whole game design, but also why they wanted to include most of the famous cheeses of France. But there are a couple of other cheeses here that I want to talk about. Now, an interesting one is Brie. So here we have Brie. It's a soft cheese, apparently ages for 1 month, whereas usually Brie actually ages much longer than that. But we also have Fromage de Meaux. Brie obviously comes from the Brie region near Paris in France, but today one of the protected styles of Brie is Brie de Meaux. So I can't help but wonder if Fromage de Meaux, which is, according to the game, aging for 2 months, which is fairly standard for Brie de Meaux, is actually Brie, whereas this Brie, separate card, is maybe the commercialized style of Brie that's more like Camembert, because Brie and Camembert in this game are in the same aging range, whereas Fromage de Meaux, which also looks bigger compared to this chunk of Brie, actually has the proper Brie, much larger size. I wonder if Fromage de Meaux is in fact Brie de Meaux, because I couldn't find any information on a cheese called Fromage de Meaux. So I think this is actually Brie de Meaux, and this should probably be something else. So then we have this blue cheese, Bleu de Bresse, and I should have probably apologized to all the French people for butchering all the names of these cheeses. Now, this cheese, as far as I can tell, didn't exist in the early 20th century. It was a cheese that kind of came into being after World War II, so that's after 1945. Which I think I can make a pretty strong case for not being early 20th century. That's got to be mid 20th century at least. So this cheese likely wasn't around in the early 20th century. So historically inaccurate there. And the other thing about all of these different types of cheeses is that a couple of Swiss cheeses seem to have snuck in. So we have Gruyere, which is a Swiss cheese, Emmental, which is a Swiss cheese, and Raclette, which is a Swiss cheese. Now, I think all of these three, or at least Gruyere and definitely Raclette, are also made in France, but these days they have to kind of go by different names or be called something slightly different or clearly marked as being made in France so as not to be confused with their Swiss counterparts. However, these particular rules didn't really exist in the early 20th century, so even though these are Swiss cheeses, most of them were made in the area of France that borders with Switzerland, so they're sort of made in the same sort of area, and it's only more recently that rules have come into place which designate what is considered the Swiss version of Gruyere and what's considered the French version, for example. And the French version usually has to go by a different name compared to the Swiss one because the Swiss won the legal battles. So there are a couple of cheeses that today we would consider Swiss cheeses that have made it into this deck, but I think in the early 20th century they would also have been seen as French cheeses because those protection rules didn't really come into play until the second half of the 20th century rather than the early 20th century, so they would have been considered French cheeses at the time, I think. There may well be others in here. If you see other cheeses in here that come from places other than France, do let me know, because I may have missed some. So overall, Fromage gets a lot of the details of French cheesemaking in the early 20th century right. There are some kind of niggly details like the inclusion of Strasbourg on the map of France in early 20th century, and at least one cheese not made before World War II, and also the use of jam in cheesemaking that you could kind of critique. But I think overall it's a really cool game, it has a lot of cheesemaking elements, and it's pretty accurate to early 20th century France. So, I mean, if you're interested in board games and like cheese and cheese history, I think it might be worth getting a copy. Just to reiterate, this is not in any way a sponsored post. I like this game, and I think you guys as my audience would also like it, particularly if you like board games. So overall, it's pretty historically accurate, and it's also a fun game to play as well, either by yourself or with a bunch of fellow cheese historians, perhaps. Do let me know if you've come across Fromage, and maybe if you've played it, let me know if you enjoyed it or what you thought of the game. Also let me know if there were other details about this game that I could have commented on that I might have missed, or anything else that you found interesting or quirky about the game. Let me know in the comments below. That's it for this video, so thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, do feel free to like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. There will be more cheese history videos where we talk about the history of different types of cheese coming up. So I'll see you then for more cheese history.